Hello, everyone. This is Derek Taylor for HIST 141, U.S. History since 1877. This is our lecture on post-World War I America, 1920s. America roaring, post-war America, 1919 to 1930. The decade after we involve ourselves in the First World War and help bring it to a successful conclusion. Usually, and this is referring to the nod toward the idea of the roaring 20s when life was really good in the 1920s, which it was until it wasn't. Until all of a sudden it crashed at the end. And so that's what this is about, the post-war life, changes that were wrought after World War I, and how we get ourselves into a global depression. So let's get started. So after World War I, the world has really changed, as I kind of mentioned before. But the biggest thing is that America really is now a great power. It had been before, but it's almost by default now. Prior to World War I, London, and therefore Britain, was still the financial center of the global economy after World War I because of the enormous costs financially and otherwise the war. That responsibility unofficially, of course, unofficially shifts from London to New York. And so the United States becomes the great financial center of the world. And it will have an outsized influence anyway. Even though it becomes a major international power, it is not yet a military superpower, mainly because, as after every war we fought up until World War II, that will change things. The United States draws its military down after World War I, so it doesn't become that overnight, but it is a behemoth striding the globe financially, and as we'll see, culturally. And of course, you come back from World War I, are these more democratic times? This is a more democratic age. As you're going to see in some ways, yes. If you mean, what do you mean by democratic? I guess more egalitarian a little bit. But in other ways, no. As you're going to see, there are still a lot of things that are not, no society is perfectly equal anyway. But still, it's something, that was seen as, World War I by Woodrow Wilson as a war for democracy, doesn't necessarily lead to democratic outcomes. You see both in the United States, but in Europe as well. And then finally, one of the things that happens and it comes of age in the 1920s is, if you want to, I call it the celebrity regime. You have now, radio, things like this, modern media, which creates an international sort of cult of celebrity. As you're going to see, involves the United States, but has to do with Europe as well. And this sort of need for celebrity, striking to me, it arises in between the two world wars. And as we'll see, it's kind of indicative of the times in terms of mass audiences and what they want to hear and see. But that's very much a matter of American, what your textbook calls soft power. It's cultural power, which, because of World War I, its effect on Europe, it leaves America in a position it's never been in before in many ways. So let's talk about culture in the Roaring 20s. And we kind of mentioned this last time. That's what we talked about in discussion. And the true arrival of modernism as an artistic movement, which it's a response to the breakdown of the war, but also other things. And it's a real self-conscious rejection of tradition, a rejection of cultural rules, an experimentation with the unknown, a sort of elevation of innovation above all sorts of things. But there's a lot of rejection in modernism, a rejection of liberal middle-class beliefs, bourgeois beliefs. The idea that Western civilization was decadent and materialistic and had contributed nothing to the world but this sort of slaughter that had happened during World War I. And the art of this movement was very elitist, was very difficult. As we saw last time, it had precedence in the pre-war period. But it gets a hearing like it never had after the war because of this, for a lot of reasons. And this led especially, I'm going to mention Europe here because there again, modernism's an international movement, and it feeds into some of the cynicism of American elites after World War One. Post-war elites in Europe tended to despair a lot about the future for obvious reasons. One example is a man named Paul Valéry, as a French writer, who basically saw the sort of death of Western civilization in World War One, and that basically it sort of smashed everything, and a sense of that civilization's mortality sort of became, it sort of cast a shadow over a lot of things, definitely against the arts, across the arts. And I won't go through all these in detail, but it affected virtually everything. Painting, there was a group of writers and artists in Paris in 1919 following the war, which launched a protest movement, which came to be called Dadaism. You know what Dadaism? Dada means hobby horse in French, it's a child's toy. And the idea was it's absurd because everything is absurd, because life is absurd, life is meaningless. The war has revealed the sham that Western civilization is, and so everything is absurd. And so these painters frequently mock convention and standards of beauty and everything. I'll show you in a moment. Marcel Duchamp, like mentioned last time, whose work was shown at the 1913 Armory Show in the United States, was at the center of this movement. And he's the one who painted a copy of the Mona Lisa with a mustache on it. We'll get to that in a moment. Surrealist painters will borrow from the works of Sigmund Freud and later Carl Jung, the idea that dreams free people from the tyranny of reason. The subterranean, the subconscious is what's important. Salvador Dali is famous for his work, The Persistence of Memory. This is 1931. It's a picture of the melting clocks. You've probably seen it. That's him. The idea that the world has been kind of deranged gets into all these things. I won't go through it in too much detail. Modern music. This is the beginning of modern classical music. If you know what atonality is, or atonal music, this is the abandonment of rules of tonality. Tonality just means music whose hierarchy of pitches is arranged around a single note, providing the foundation for harmony, etc., etc. Well, they wanted to get rid of harmony. Atonal music is basically disharmonious noise in many ways. And why would anybody want to listen to this? Well, this is the whole gist of modernist art, is that the world is awful. We have to make art to reflect that. And probably the most famous, this is where I'm getting to all this stuff in America here, is I think one of the most famous works of art produced by these modernists was by an American, Thomas Stearns Eliot, T.S. Eliot. Was born in, of all places, St. Louis, Missouri, but was from an old New England family. Eventually made his way to England, doing his dissertation in philosophy, which he never finished, but he remained there. So he was one of these expatriates. This will be a big theme here. Has been, I guess, before, but expatriates, people leaving the United States, and he becomes a British subject eventually. But he published a poem in 1922 called The Wasteland, which is a reference to Western civilization. Oop, I got backtrack there. Hold on. Kind of backtrack there, in which, he evokes the sort of destruction of the war, and that civilization is now in pieces. And one of the last lines of the poem is, "These fragments I have shored against my ruins," referring to the fragments of civilization and culture. All that sort of sensibility gets caught up in The Wasteland. It was, by the way, a very popular poem, and it's a difficult read if you're not used to that sort of thing. But it was popular among undergraduates at Oxford in the 1920s. One of my teachers back as an undergraduate at the University of Florida told me that in the 1920s you would have students at Oxford shout sections from the poem to each other across the quad because they thought it was so cool. Anyway, this is the sort of idea that's in the air. And a lot of this kind of mentality, and this is my point, this cynicism and sense of despair, feeds into American artists and intellectuals in the 1920s. Some of them had experienced the war firsthand. That was a big thing. And it was so much a devastating experience, even for, again, America won the war, came out on top in some ways, but it's still left a mark on some people's lives. And the American writer Gertrude Stein dubbed the people who survived this the lost generation. This gets taken up by Ernest Hemingway, but people like John Dos Passos. I mentioned Hemingway. He wrote a couple of novels, The Sun Also Rises and Farewell to Arms, to talk about the war and its dehumanizing consequences. Already mentioned Eliot. And then people like the war and the post-war and the sense of destruction that it unleashed accelerated people exploring that sort of theme of Freudianism, the dark psyche and the underbelly of the human psyche. People like the playwright Eugene O'Neill um, did explore this in some of his plays in the 1920s. You also had, and as you're going to see, this gets us to this, is you have a conflict between more traditional ideas of American life and more modern ideas. And many writers saw fit I think they went too far, to be honest, but they exposed what they saw as the sort of pettiness and the hypocrisy of small town life. The most famous of these is Sinclair Lewis, this writer whose novel Babbitt was about the disillusionment of a small town salesman. Later work, Elmer Gantry, was a satire of an evangelical minister who was kind of corrupt and crooked. But critics loved these works, even though they didn't sell very well. And he became the first person to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And again, you're having this disconnect between elite culture and mass culture is really a theme of the 1920s in many ways. Even more famous than this was, of course, F. Scott Fitzgerald's book, The Great Gatsby, which is probably one of the few books you got to read in high school from this period. And again, this is sort of an indictment of Americans' pursuit of material wealth and other sorts of things. And Gatsby was not popular at the time, by the way. It was kind of a failure commercially. It's only later on it became popular, because at the time everybody was like, "Hey, we got money, it's good." So yeah, but it sort of left a mark at the war on the more intellectual, artistic sides of American life. And here is Marcel Duchamp's painting, LHOOQ, from 1919. You see Tableau Dada par Marcel Duchamp, and you can kind of see the painting there. All it is a picture of the Mona Lisa and him putting a mustache on it. Again, meant to sort of puncture the pretensions of art and civilization. It's almost like anti-art. He's also the one, by the way, who he did a work of sculpture, which he called Fountain, which was in fact a urinal. So that's him. That's the same guy. That's just a picture of Ernest Hemingway and some of his friends in 1920s Paris. He, like a bunch of people, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, many others, made their way to Paris in the 1920s, escape what they saw as the narrowness of American life, et cetera, et cetera. So there's Ernesto Hemingway. What were they escaping? They were escaping the masses, to be honest with you. And the term Church of the Masses was actually given to movie theaters. This is the great age. It's the golden age of radio, first of all. I'll go through that first, I guess. But American radio and film became global in their reach during the 1920s. In 1919, General Electric created RCA to expand U.S. presence in foreign radio markets. And this emerged as a major provider of radio transmission in Latin America and East Asia. So they're cornering the market almost instantaneously with radio. And so this is all part of the spread of mass production, consumer culture, and cheap media. Then there were the movies. Again, they got that name Church of the Masses because you had, of course, these big theaters people would go into. It became this big experience. This is hard for us to understand after the age of lockdowns and streaming video, where we don't want that stuff, because going to the movies kind of sucks because there's people talking and everything. Back then, it was a big sort of event for people to go to. And by 1910, movie-making industry, it started before then, had moved to Southern California to take advantage of cheap land and sunshine and so on and so forth. A lot of the people who went to California initially were people who came from back east. And some of these early Hollywood directors were they were characters, let's put it that way. One of them, I can't remember his name, went out there partly to escape creditors from back east, and he slept with a shotgun by his bed, and in case they showed up. So it was kind of the wild west out there. So by the 1920s, you have the creation of large studios by United Artists, Paramount, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, which are run by immigrants, mostly Eastern European Jewish immigrants. And it is by the end of the World War I, partly because of the destruction of the First World War, Hollywood reigns as the movie capital of the world, producing 90% of all the films in the world. New feature-length movies in large ornate theaters attracted middle class as well as working class audiences. It really was kind of the universal art form for everybody, basically. And yeah, and more than this, because of the the break in the wars, American movies dominated foreign markets. By 1925, American films made up 95% of the movies screened in Britain, 80% in Latin America, and 70% in France. Britain and France instituted quotas requiring that the number of imported films not exceed the number of domestic ones. And in response to this, Hollywood set up studios of their own in Europe to turn out hundreds of what they call quota quickies to allow the flow of imports to continue. So American mass media dominates the world from 1920s onward. And this kind of goes together with what can only be called an international cult, I guess it is a cult, of celebrity. And the first person who really probably, there are some actors who'll be well known worldwide now. We'll get to one in a moment. But one of the first international celebrities is actually Charles Lindbergh, who made his transatlantic flight in 1927. And when he touched back down, when he landed in Paris in 1927, well, not just Paris, but everywhere he went, he was mobbed by thousands of admirers. Hysterical. A lot of them were women. He's kind of a good looking guy. And his movements were followed in the press everywhere he went. And so he was kind of this first, I'm thinking of the 1960s and like Elvis and the Beatles and stuff like that. But this is the beginning of, well, our pathetic, stupid obsession with celebrities. and it's not I think it's not a coincidence. It comes about after World War I, when people are looking for something after all that destruction to sort of get out all of their irrational impulses, I guess. But it's a peculiar American phenomenon. Again, they export to the rest of the globe. And so it's an example, what you're in your textbook calls this soft power, the exercise of popular cultural influence, intentionally and otherwise, by the United States. And this, by the way, caused angst in a lot of places. Like British intellectuals were kind of, they were angsty about this. They were afraid that this was going to, overwhelm traditional British culture. They were kind of right. It kind of did in a lot of ways. You go to Britain today, it's very Americanized. And so, yeah, it's definitely something. It's a change here. And here we have a picture of a radio ad from 1926, RCA, the Radiola. And you can see this here, ad from the Saturday Evening Post. See a couple with, I guess, grandma there, mother, and says below, "There's no loneliness where there is a radiola." See the magic of radio. If you don't want to have to visit your miserable in-laws, all you have to do is get them a radio and then abandon them. I'm being cynical, but no, this is the way they advertise these things in the 1920s. Here is an image of one of the first big movie stars, silent movie stars, Charlie Chaplin, actually, and a child star, Jackie Coogan, who I'm certain was probably taken advantage of by people in Hollywood back in the 1920s. But oh well, there you go. Charlie Chaplin, the little tramp. They made that character famous in the 1920s. Was actually a friend of Sir Winston Churchill, if you don't know. Churchill said that he admired him despite his bolshy politics. He was very left-wing, apparently. So that's him. And this is a picture from the 1920s of Charles Lindbergh, who again, has made his long flight across the Atlantic and became a celebrity later on. Also, from if I remember correctly, kind of a Nazi sympathizer later on. So there was a dark side in the 1920s, if I put it that way. Well, that's him, the first international celebrity. And then finally, the thing that's probably most known for the Roaring Twenties is consumerism, is spending money, is yeah, people buying junk, right? And hey, what's more democratic than that? If we talk about becoming democratic, everybody's buying the same stuff. And that could be sort of in this way. But of course, um, what happens, it is democratic in a way because even um, working class Americans can purchase cheap, mass produced goods, watch movies, stuff like this. But it comes with a price, and that price is that you have a culture of credit beginning in the 1920s, where people buy things. By 1929, 40% of American households own a radio, electric refrigerators and vacuum cleaners come into use in affluent homes, and so on and so forth. But a lot of it had to do with people basically buying things on credit and having to pay later. And again, these loans, of course, tended to not be as good of a thing for people who didn't have as much money. So you could go into debt pretty easily, right? And so it's kind of perilous to people who are living on the margins of economic stability, as it were. And then finally, one of the things that happens with the United States in the 1920s, it becomes very much an automobile nation. Mass production of cars plays a major role in the economic boom in the 1920s. In 1929 alone, Americans spent $2.5 billion on cars. By the end of that decade, Americans owned 23 million cars, about 80% of the world's automobiles, or an average of one car for every 6 people. And the expansion of that industry stimulated everything else: steel, petroleum, chemical, rubber, glass industries, et cetera, and provided for 3.7 million jobs. Highway construction became $1 billion a year enterprise. It changed a lot of things. People buying these cars. It changed the way Americans, for example, spent their leisure time. Though gasoline was not cheap, people like to go. It's like going on vacation, It is going on vacation, I should say. Gas stations spring up, hotels, drive-in restaurants to cater to drivers. Basically means the end, by the way, not the end. They're still around. We still have Amtrak kept alive on government subsidies, but it marks the decline of the great age of the train, which is in some ways a more civilized means of transportation. But it means a changing sense of space. People don't have to live where they work anymore. They already hadn't. They had trolleys and things like that, and subways, but now they definitely don't. So people begin moving out to the suburbs. Car ownership spurs the growth of the suburbs. And in fact, as you'll see in a moment, the first suburban shopping center in the United States is founded in 1924. And of all places, Kansas City, Missouri. That would be Country Club Plaza. So you have all this stuff reshaping the way people live their lives in ways that are kind of leveling to a certain degree, these changing of spaces, but not always. Not always. Sometimes they can. Consumerism can be leveling. It can also, of course, make things more stratified in a variety of ways, but it's definitely triumphant in the 1920s. Here's just a picture of a bunch of cars on Jacksonville Beach in 1923 in Florida. Again, you can kind of see this is I don't know, the beginning of spring break. I don't know, and probably is. People go down to Florida driving, right? So again, the cars make that possible. And there she is. There's Country Club Plaza, 1925 shopping center, built by J.C. Nichols. The actual first name, but that's why he has a street named over there on the plaza. But that is one of the first ones right nearby in that time frame. However, despite all of the prosperity, there's a lot of conflict brewing beneath the surface. And it comes out sometimes during the war. And one of these conflicts is conflicts over race. Remember, during the war, blacks migrated north to work in factories. There are African Americans who serve in the war. A lot of this led to African Americans having an expectation that, hey, they would be treated better because of all this. And this tended to exacerbate racism, especially in the South. Lynching nearly doubled in the South during the war, and race riots broke out all over the North. And there were a lot of tensions, by the way, in the North that led to all this stuff. Um, Black voters could determine the outcome of elections in a lot of big places, big cities in the North. And of course, Blacks competed with whites for jobs and housing. And so the return of Black war veterans and the increase of Black migrants to the North led to a backlash. And there were a series of massive riots, race riots, which led to the deaths of many Black citizens in the 1920s. There was a lynching in 1921 in Rosewood, Florida, which led to Black citizens arming themselves, in which mobs of whites burned their houses down and attacked them with no intervention by police. There were deadly riots in St. Louis in 1917, Chicago in 1919, an alleged rape in Tulsa, Oklahoma in, I believe it's 1921, but I don't have the dates here, led to a white mob burning 35 blocks of Greenwood, Oklahoma to the ground and killing several dozen African Americans. So that brings about the conflict directly, does the war there. On the other hand, it brings about a sort of erosion of labor rights. There's labor unrest. During the war, when the economy was being overseen almost directly by a Democratic administration supporting labor, it had led to an increase in the power of labor unions. However, as you saw from our readings the last time we talked about World War I, you did have there was a lot of angst about communism, and so some of these unions got physically assaulted by people who didn't like that sort of thing. And after the war, employers resumed their attacks on unions. Inflation threatened to wipe out wage increases. And this led to a series of strikes in 1919. Strikes were held by steelworkers, shipyard workers in Seattle, policemen in Boston. Governor Calvin Coolidge of Massachusetts fired the entire Boston police force, and that strike failed and replaced. Coolidge was awarded becoming the Republican vice presidential nomination in 1920, which they won. One factor in all this is about organized labor's failure is partly an anxiety about unassimilated immigrants, because a lot of immigrant workers, of course. And this fed into the so-called Red Scare of the 1919-1920. People were terrified about the Russian Revolution of 1917, in which Bolsheviks took power, communists took power. Woodrow Wilson actually sent troops, several thousand troops to Russia at the end of the war, hoping to weaken the Bolshevik regime. They almost got into a war with them, if you can imagine, which would have been insane. And American fears of communism deepened as the communists basically tried to export the revolution. They held what they called a Third International, or Comintern, whose goal was to it's a international meeting of communists, whose goal was to export communist doctrine and revolution to the rest of the world. At the same time, you had tensions mounting in the spring of early 1919. There was a series of bombings. In response, the Attorney General Mitchell Palmer staged a bunch of what are come to be known as Palmer raids, in which federal agents stormed the headquarters of radical organizations. A lot of them were illegal immigrants. They lacked citizenship, and so they were deported as a result of all this. Palmer even predicted that a conspiracy attempt to overthrow the government would occur on May Day, so big labor communist holiday in 1920. Nothing occurred, and so the whole thing sort of died down. But at the height of the scare, a couple of alien draft evaders, Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were arrested for robbery and murder, and were denied a new trial, even though evidence surfaced that suggested their innocence. And they were executed in 1927. So you have all these things coming to the fore about these things in the 1920s. And the forces of reaction tend to triumph in a lot of ways in public life in the 1920s. One of the big signs of this is the achievement in 1920 of prohibition. It passes, excuse me, Congress in 1917 and is ratified by almost every state, and becomes effective in January 1920. Banning, quote, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors everywhere in the United States. This represents, in one respect, the triumph of a progressive cause. Remember, the temperance movement was a sort of women's cause, but it also represents the triumph of rural America, and particularly Protestant rural America, who was opposed to this, or excuse me, supported this. And its defenders hailed this as a victory for health, for morals, and stuff like this. But of course, it was circumvented, widely circumvented, and it contributed to, of course, an increase in organized crime. As a result of this is where Al Capone comes from. He's a bootlegger more than anything else. But it would remain in force until 1933, when it was repealed. Second major force of reaction is that of nativism. By 1929, 93 U.S. cities had populations over 100,000. New York's exceeded 7 million. Los Angeles had more than 1.2 million. And again, this meant for culture clashes, because the beliefs and the lives of the way people lived in cities was very different from people in small towns and farming areas. Again, rural Protestants especially perceived this as a dire threat to their way of life. A lot of people blamed immigration, for example, for perceived as America's moral decline. And this led to this nativism is what fed into the National Origins Act of 1924. For the first time, the United States limited European migration to the United States. It limited annual immigration to the U.S. from any country to 2% of that nationality's percentage of the U.S. population, as it had stood in 1890. It was aimed to keep Eastern and Southern European types out: Greeks, Poles, Russians, Italians, and so on and so forth. 1929, Congress would impose even stricter quotas, setting a cap of 150,000 immigrants per year from Europe, and continued to ban most immigrants from Asia. The only group that didn't get banned were actually people from Latin America. There were plenty of Mexicans who came over in the 1920s, coming for jobs and stuff like this. And this, by the way, was not just about a matter of nativism, but also the labor unions who supported this. Big labor, because again, they were afraid of immigrant competition with their workers. Those combined impulses, nativism and labor concerns, led to it being passed. And you had laws being passed at the state level as well, passing anti-immigrant measures. And then finally, maybe the biggest expression of the force of reaction, and partly nativist, partly about all these other sorts of things, is the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, of all things. And it was sort of revived on the basis of that film, The Birth of a Nation, in 1915, which was a film glorifying the Reconstruction era Ku Klux Klan. A group of Southerners revived this group. However, this was a little bit different than revived Klan, because its motto was Native White Protestant Supremacy. But it really did not aim itself only at Blacks anymore. It also targeted immigrants, Catholics, and Jews, with physical intimidation, economic boycotts, all those sorts of things. And more to the point, it quickly became a nationwide organization. Membership in the Klan would rise to about I don't want to say over 3 million in the decade of the 1920s, including many women. And the group for a long time wielded very serious political clout. Although it began to decline after the passage of those immigration acts, because that was partly what it was about, it remained strong in the South thereafter, as well as other things in this era. And so it represented a sort of growing trend in this direction. It's pretty amazing. I mean, you have lynchings, things like this, acts of arson in the 1920s. There's a little bit more of, sort of anti-Jewish conspiracy type theories in the 1920s becoming more prominent among people like your textbook mentions Henry Ford, people like that. But just give you an idea of how powerful the National Klan was in the 1920s. When he becomes president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, one of his appointees to the Supreme Court was a guy named Hugo Black. Hugo Black had actually been a member of the Ku Klux Klan at one point in his life. So that's how powerful it had been. It wasn't a sort of, you'd think that how did the guy get hired and get appointed, but that didn't keep him out. And here's just an image of a race riot of Chicago in 1921. You can see Dan there, the image. This is a cartoon, anti-Bolshevik cartoon from 1919. You see the American flag, and then below that you have down there Bolshevism, Reds, anarchy. Pretty clear implications there. Excuse me. This is a Ku Klux Klan parade in Washington, D.C. in the 1920s, which, as you can see, it's a women's parade. Women were very prominent in the Klan, if you can imagine. We usually think of them as men, but it's odd. A lot of women are involved. And this is an interesting map because it gives you the sense of the reach of the Klan. Obviously, it came out of the South and would still remain strong there, but in the 1920s, it spread across the country. California, Oregon, the West, Colorado. Look at the blue dots tell you where you have governors elected with Klan support. One in Kansas. Lots of influence in the Midwest, even in the Northeast, Maine, Massachusetts. When Hugo Black was elected to the Supreme Court in the 1930s, the Klan in Massachusetts burned a cross in his honor. Can give you an idea as to how widespread this is in the Northeast. So crazy times. And then finally, the thing that probably symbolizes to a certain degree that clash of worldviews in the 1920s was the Scopes trial of 1925. This is where you get a serious battle over, of course, the teaching of evolution in public schools. At the state and local levels, again, Protestants, conservative Protestants, fundamentalist Protestants, whatever you want to call them, so to mandate school curricula that was based on biblical idea of creation. 1925, Tennessee's legislature outlawed the teaching of, quote, any theory that denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and teaches instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals, unquote. So this idea finally comes to a head in the 1920s. And the American Civil Liberties Union, which had been formed during the Red Scare to protect free speech rights, challenged the law's constitutionality. It intervened in the case of John T. Scopes, a high school biology teacher. And in fact, it actually is the one who had put him up to it. They actually got him to go get a textbook and try to teach evolution in class to test the law. And so he was put on trial for this, arrested, and this trial became a media circus. And it attracted national attention because Clarence Darrow, a famous criminal lawyer, defended Scopes, while William Jennings Bryan, the three-time Democratic presidential candidate, three-time loser, got killed 3 times, spoke for the prosecution. So these celebrities coming down, right? This is like the first trial of the century. The press dubbed the Scopes case the monkey trial. And so it both refers to Darwin's theory, but also the atmosphere of the trial itself, which was obviously about more than the law itself, and which was actually broadcast live over a Chicago radio station. And so it becomes this sort of symbolic thing. It's been memorialized in that film, Inherit the Wind. In fact, and we didn't discuss this last time about eugenics, but eugenics played a role in this event, however. If you, one of the extra readings I gave you for this week in the module are excerpts from the textbook that John Scopes used, which got him arrested in 1925. And it's called A Civic Biology. the main title of it, and it was from 1914. And part of what, again, the big thing that Brian objected to, again, he's a fundamentalist. He took a literal view of Genesis. Besides that, one of the things he objected to was that there were passages in that book which basically out and out recommended eugenics. We'll go over some of this because this is one of the things that Brian was opposed to. Remember, I talked about last time in the lecture, one of the few groups opposed to eugenics to court in the 1920s were fundamentalist Protestants. So it gets back to even bigger issues about, okay, human nature and those other sorts of things. But it represents this clash of views, in some ways overdone and not quite, I think, what people think of it as in many ways, but a little more interesting than I think usually presented. But also has those other connotations said with eugenics. And there's just a picture of, on the left, Clarence Darrow at the trial, and on the right-hand side, that's William Jennings Bryan in Tennessee in 1925. All right, so you have that going on. You also have, mentioned urban life, how urban life is so different. Well, it's different. Well, several things are different. One of them that's different in these bigger cities that you have, to a degree, more ethnic and racial mixing than you would have elsewhere. And one of the great achievements of the early 20th century in musical terms is, of course, the emergence of jazz. It's a form of music coalesces in New Orleans and other parts of the South before World War I, sort of mixes blues, ragtime, and other popular forms into a sort of ensemble style where people, keep a improvised beat up over basic melodic line. And majority of early jazz musicians were Black, but white performers began introducing elements of European concert music into jazz. And so jazz became a national art form in the 1920s. Musicians kept developing it. And one of the key figures in this was the trumpeter Louis Armstrong. And it tended to follow, as it moved up from the South to northern cities, the paths of the Great Migration. So from South to North and then Western cities. And it also became popular because of radio. Radio helped popularize jazz. New York became the hub of the publishing industry, and so white listeners who, again, part of the reason for their attraction to this is they thought it was quote unquote primitive, and so the idea that they're doing something subversive or whatever by listening to Black music, going to Black mixed race clubs, those sorts of things. To hear the quote unquote Harlem sound of Duke Ellington and other stars. And you begin to get, through jazz, the recording industry beginning to specifically market products aimed at urban African Americans. And it tends to bring African Americans to the center stage of urban life. Again, it's by one of the things that caused the clashes. But it became, of course, the signature music of the age. This is where you get the phrase, that's F. Scott Fitzgerald, the jazz age. So it's representative of modern life with its mixing, its ethnic mixing, its crossing of racial boundaries, allegedly. Lots of prejudice obviously didn't go away, but it's part of this. You also have in the cities just a new, you have new social mores. There's a relaxing of social standards, moral standards during the 1920s, which coincided with all this. Certainly in Europe after World War I, there were noticeable changes in behavior, sexual behavior, I should say, noticed by historians. In France, for example, during World War I, the number of illegitimate births nearly doubled during the war, as did reported levels of things like venereal disease. The war opens up, as war always does, opportunities for camp followers, recreational sex is the best way to put it, for troops. And so you had a bunch of young American men who went from the farm. That's where you get that World War I song from. How you gonna keep them down on the farm if they've seen Paris? That's what it's hinting at. So when they came back, they had a changed outlook, I guess you could say. And again, a more permissive culture opens up in the 1920s in cities. And women benefited from this public relaxation of morals. And this is where you get the emergence of what's sometimes called the new woman. Again, I think the phrase is actually coined before the war, but this is the ideal of the independent working woman who goes out alone at night without a chaperone, who's into the latest fashions, et cetera, et cetera. Um, all this is probably more ideal than reality. And when I say ideal, it was pushed by advertisers in big cities. Again, they're marketing things like, makeup to women and, all this other stuff. It's a real thing. These flapper girls were a real thing. They were there, and they become a sort of symbol of women's emancipation, social, sexual to a certain degree. Um, Despite some increased opportunities economically and politically, however, for the most part, this didn't catch on. Partly, by the way, is because most women couldn't afford it. It was in some ways an advertising gimmick. Also because, for the most part, traditional ideals of womanhood still held sway. It really would up until the 1950s and 60s. But this is, again, is a major change, at least in urban areas, and represents a real, again, serious shift, again, especially, elites in cities versus, people outside of them. And then finally, we kind of already hinted at this, you have, again, because of the Great Migration, African Americans coming to the big cities in the North, you have places like Harlem becoming beacons of African American culture in places like New York. And this is what we refer to as the Harlem Renaissance, where Black artists and writers move there, break with older traditions. Some of them even asserted ties to Africa. People, writers and artists of this period, Black writers, championed things like race pride. Um, you had, again, this is, won't go into this too much detail, but people like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, great writers in their own right, create a sort of alternative. Again, they're not necessarily accepted totally into the larger society, but they create their own little renaissance there in Harlem. This is also a result of this flourishing in the cities. Again, very different vibe than you would have in the other parts of the country. It contributes to that growth, but also tensions as a result of it. Here's just a picture of a Life magazine from 1926, Spirit of 26. Again, 143 years of liberty and 7 years of prohibition. Again, so you have jazz being celebrated. And this is a picture for African American art. Archibald Motley, Blues, 1929. Again, urbane, sophisticated, and ethnically mixed. Despite all this, in terms of politics, is the business of America. That's Calvin Coolidge, who was supposed to have said the business of America is business. In 1920, the Republicans came back into power. Remember, Wilson had a stroke at the end of his term in 1920, and when they came back in, it was only 1920. Democrats nominated the governor of Ohio, James Cox, and he was pretty much wiped out. And this began a series of 3 different Republican presidents for the next 12 years. Warren Harding was elected in 1920. He got into a bit of a scandal. He died of a heart attack in 1923. As evidence was just coming to light that parts of administration were riddled with corruption. This is the so-called Teapot Dome scandal. Concerned the leasing of reserves of government oil in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, to private companies. After his death, Calvin Coolidge maintained Republican dominance, where he was a much less corrupt guy. He was fairly straight-laced other than Warren Harding, but he won in 1924. And again, partly because of divides within the Democratic Party. You had them deeply divided over things like prohibition, immigration, and so their conventions really weren't. They were divided for most of these years, and what's one of the reasons that they couldn't pull this off. And so big business is triumphant in political terms as the Republicans come back in. the same time, political campaigns, emphasized domestic issues in the 1920s. But the United States, despite the fact they stayed out of Europe, remained engaged in foreign affairs. In particular, they want to advance U.S. business interests by encouraging private banks to make foreign loans. They hoped these loans would stimulate growth and increase demand for U.S. products in developing markets in Latin America. When in 1922, American banks offered an immense loan to Bolivia at a hefty profit, the State Department pressured Bolivia to accept it. It forced Bolivia to agree to financial oversight by a commission under the bank's control. A similar arrangement was basically forced on El Salvador in 1923, although a couple of other countries managed to sort of reject all this. Where stronger action was needed, the United States actually intervened militarily to do this, to force things like repayment of debts. The U.S. Marines occupied Nicaragua almost continuously from 1912 to 1923, the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924, and Haiti from 1950 to 1934. And again, this is America. This is the Roosevelt correlate, right? Wherever the internal affairs of Latin America impinge on our interests, we're going to go in there and we're going to clean house. But it had its critics, and by the 1920s, dollar diplomacy was on the defensive, mainly because of what sometimes gets called, in a derogatory way, isolationism. A lot of people who were did not like this. A lot of Americans who just want to stay out of these sorts of wars. At the same time, political leaders became frustrated. The results of dollar diplomacy, as it's called, didn't actually do much. It managed to get loans repaid, which profited bankers, but it didn't really do much to build prosperity overseas. And so it comes in for a harsh redressing at the end of the era. And it will change under FDR in the beginning of his administration. In 1928, by then, it created the climate for a fairly raucous election. In 1928, the Democrats had drawn strength from voters in the South, white voters in the South, immigrants in the North. Again, I mentioned these were divided in the 1920s because of all the things going on. But in 1928, the urban wing of the party got control, and they nominated one of their own. The governor of New York, state of New York, Al Smith, was the first sort of urban working class candidate, maybe the only one in American history. He's a grandson of Irish peasants. He'd risen through the New York party machine in New York City, became a reformer. But the fact that he was Irish, the fact that he was Catholic, and he was the first Roman Catholic to run for president, really offended, of course, a lot of small town Americans. He spoke in a really thick New York accent. As you'll see a picture in a moment, he sported a brown derby hat that highlighted his working class ethnic origins. Middle class reformers didn't like his ties to Tammany Hall. Temperance advocates didn't like him because he was a wet, liked to drink. But his biggest handicap was his Catholicism. Many Protestant leaders came out against him outright because they thought he could not be free of the Pope's influence in politics. And in the event, he was wiped out by Herbert Hoover, who was the Secretary of Commerce, a very competent man. He enjoyed the benefit of 8 years of Republican prosperity, and he promised that this would continue. And Hoover won what looks like one of the biggest victories I can think of in electoral terms. He won 58% of the popular vote and won 444 electoral votes to Smith's 87. So it was a wipeout, in other words. And there's a picture of Al Smith, 1928, campaigning with his derby hat. The avatar of the working class, again, gets up there and gets wiped out. By the way, his running mate from that year, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, very different person. Roosevelt, of course, as we'll get to next time, is practically American royalty. Came from a very patrician family, but they nominated Al Smith instead. And then finally, Herbert Hoover. And Hoover is an interesting guy in his own right, as we'll see. We'll talk about him more next time, but he becomes president in 1928. He'll be president, of course, when the Great Depression hits. Tends to get blamed for it, I think, more than he should. An interesting guy at one point in his early career, before he became kind of into politics, he was actually a geologist, and it's kind of a funny story, but he is the only president I'm aware of who was ever able to speak Mandarin Chinese. That's right. How did this guy from Iowa learn to speak Mandarin Chinese? He worked for an oil company as a geologist in China as a young man, so he learned to speak Chinese. Interesting figure, thoughtful guy. You'll see this next time when we read some of those excerpts from him, but gets caught in the wrong moment in a lot of ways, but wins a smashing victory. You can see how big of a victory this is from the map. Al Smith won, let's see, one, two, I mean, maybe basically won 7 or 8 states. It's a pretty big wipeout. In any case, as all good things do, they have to come to an end. And throughout the 1920s, corporations had dominated the American economy. It's 1920s, large-scale corporations headed by CEOs have replaced individual or family-run firms. Waves of consolidation of companies had led to the 200 largest businesses controlling half the country's non-banking corporate wealth in 1929. A lot of these mergers occurred in industries like chemicals, electrical appliances, rising industries, necessary ones. But it's not one, it's not like with Carnegie and Rockefeller. It's more like a few companies dominating major producers in each field. At the same time, lots of mergers between Wall Street's banks enhanced the role of New York as the financial center of the United States and increasingly the world. And again, the types of mergers they don't let happen anymore, actually, for obvious reasons. And in the 1920s was the heyday of what your textbook calls welfare capitalism. And this basically means that a system of labor relations that stress management's responsibility for their employers' well-being. Employers hope this would build a loyal workforce and head off strikes. That is to say, big companies like General Electric, US Steel would offer workers health insurance and old age pensions, really generous ones, good stuff. But the plans only covered about 5% of the industrial workforce. After World War I, immediately after it, the United States experienced a series of economic shocks. This was due partly to the conversion from wartime production to peacetime. Inflation ramped up, but it dropped again between 1922 and 1929, and the economy boomed, of course, in those periods. Despite the boom, not all areas of the economy prospered. Agriculture, in particular, which still employed about a quarter of all workers, never fully recovered from the post-war recession. Once Europe recovered, its farmers flooded world markets with grain and other farm products, causing prices to fall. Other industries like coal and textiles languished. So many rural Americans shared little of that decade's prosperity. The bottom 40% of American families had an average annual income of only $725. And again, when you think about, when I'm talking about, rural versus urban, it's not all cultural, of course. Again, the rural America got left behind by this more financialized economy, right, which didn't include them as much. So it's something to keep in mind. And what's going to happen is strains on the economy are going to start to appear. By 1927, consumer lending had become the 10th largest business in the country. Increasing numbers of Americans bought into the stock market, often with very, very unrealistic ideas about what they would get out of it. Corporate profits were so high that some companies merely plowed excess earnings into the stock market. And so you begin to have people doing risky things with the stock market by the end of the 1920s. Remember, there's not a lot of regulation of anything at this point. And this was fine as long as the economy was growing, jobs were plentiful, investments would rise, but these things didn't last. And in fact, you're going to get a stock market crash in 1929, a series of plunges between October 25th and November 13th of that year. When that happened, very few people actually understood what was going on. Deep cyclical depressions have been part of the American economy since the 1830s at least. Usually 3 or 4 years, right? Stuff that just, it happened. They tended to follow periods of rapid growth and speculation. The market rose again, actually, in late 1929, early 1930s. And while a great deal of money had been lost in the first part of this, a lot of Americans hoped this would be brief, but they were wrong. Over the next 4 years, industrial production fell by 37%. Construction plunged by 78%. Prices for crops and other raw materials, already low, fell by half. By 1932, unemployment reached a staggering 24%. And they entered what we call the Great Depression. And a lot of this, by the way, was tied to banks. A precipitous drop in consumer spending helped deepen this. Having bought things on credit for years, now facing hard times, consumers cut back, creating a cycle of falling demand and forfeited loans. In late 1930s, in the late 1930s, several major banks went under, victims of overextended credit and reckless management. And so a much larger wave of bank failures occurred in 1931, and these caused an even more severe shock because the government did not insure bank deposits. So when these banks went under, people's savings vanished. And in fact, this led at the same time, once the American banks fell, it led to a series of collapses in Europe, in Austria, Germany, other places, and led to a worldwide global crisis. Because at that point, the global economy was now being directed by the United States. And in fact, in long term, view this in a big picture sense here, the First World War is really what caused this, because it destroyed Europe politically and economically speaking in many ways. It had destabilized international systems of trade and finance. Again, Britain's central bank had played a huge role in international finance before the war. They couldn't do that afterwards. The war had disrupted the international gold standard. The United States and most European nations had tied the value of their currencies to gold. This had worked fairly well before World War I, but it was vulnerable during economic downturns when foreign investors withdrew their investments. Faced with this catastrophe in 1931, both Germany and Britain went off the gold standard. A few years later, eventually they would go off the gold standard in the United States. So you have this massive, massive, massive overnight, within a couple of years, depression setting in. How did Hoover respond to this? Well, Hoover had come of age again in America, in which you just sort of waited out these cycles of boom and bust. He didn't want to get off the gold standard, for example. He thought that move would cause damage to trade and the value of the dollar. It was trying to revive the economy and protect the nation's gold supply. Billions had already been lost by the time you get to 1932 in terms of businesses and banks failing. A partial recovery would bring unemployment down from 25 to 14%. But Hoover did take some action. He created a Reconstruction Finance Corporation to provide loans to banks, railroads, and utilities. His administration also slashed taxes, and he exhorted local and state governments to employ the jobless on public works projects. But for the most part, he and the Republicans adhered to the belief that depressions were basically healthy and self-regulating. They adhered to their long-standing faith in high protective tariffs. So they enacted the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, hoping to stimulate domestic manufacturing. This was an older way of financing government, right, other than raising taxes. Historians are divided whether or not this raising this tariff worsened depression, but it didn't help. It triggered retaliatory tariffs in other countries, and so you had, economic nationalism returning during the Great Depression. And so what's going to happen is this stuff is going to sort of swallow Hoover whole, and that's what's going to sort of make for a huge change, because people are going to become convinced that the old ways of doing things with government can't work, can't respond to this crisis. And that is why in 1932, they're going to elect someone who promises to use the power of the state to intervene in the economy in a way, at least in principle, it's never done before. Actually, they did do it during World War I, but in peacetime, it's never been done before. And then, of course, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who will propose his New Deal, which will really mark a turning point in American history in terms of political life and in many other ways. And so that's will be for next time. So that is it. That is our lecture on America in the 1920s, going from, you know, boom time, but also self-doubt to, falling into the abyss of economic catastrophe. So hope it helps you guys. I will see you all in a discussion. Take care. We'll see you next time.